Not too long ago, in a time when life was simple and free of complications, people lived off the blessings of the earth. Among them was an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor, who lived with her only son David in a humble tent in the middle of the desert. She had lost her husband many years ago, and her entire life revolved around her son, feeding him, protecting him from the cold of the night and the heat of the day. She would always tell him with love, "You are my whole life, my son." David was a kind-hearted young man, but he was always busy tending to his sheep, spending most of his days in the desert searching for grazing land. Though he never forgot his mother, he did not fully understand the depth of her love and sacrifices. Years passed quickly, and Mrs. Eleanor was not the same as before. She felt exhausted, unable to move as she once did. She would sit in front of the tent, gazing at the horizon, watching the sunset and whispering to herself, "Oh Lord, I have devoted my life to making my son happy. Bless him with a good wife who will help him in his life." One evening, while David sat by the fire, eating his simple meal, his mother looked at him tenderly and said, "David, you have grown into a man. It is time for you to get married." David stopped eating, looked at her in surprise, then smiled and said, "But I have no dowry, and you know I am busy tending to the sheep." Mrs. Eleanor chuckled, stroked his head as she had done when he was a child, and reassured him, "Do not worry, my son. I will find you a good wife, and money will not be an obstacle." From that day on, Mrs. Eleanor searched for a suitable bride for her son. She asked the neighbors and consulted the women in the village, until she heard of a young woman named Emma. Emma was known for her good morals and kind heart. She lived in a nearby village, helping her mother with household chores and lovingly caring for her younger siblings. Mrs. Eleanor visited Emma's home and spoke to her mother with honesty and warmth. It didn't take long for her to feel that Emma was the right wife for her son. After an agreement between the two families, she returned to the tent and called out to David, saying, "David, I have found you a wife, a kind-hearted girl who will bring you happiness and support you in life." David looked at his mother without asking many questions, simply smiling and saying with confidence, "Mother, I trust your choice." The wedding took place in a simple ceremony, attended by family and friends. David and Emma lived with Mrs. Eleanor in their small tent, and Emma proved to be an excellent wife, not only to David, but also a daughter to Mrs. Eleanor. She took care of her, prepared her meals, sat with her for hours, and filled her life with love. Every night before going to bed, Mrs. Eleanor would raise her hands in prayer and say, "Praise be to God. He has blessed my son with a good wife." Years passed, and David and Emma were blessed with a baby boy. The child was a precious gift to their lives. Mrs. Eleanor was overjoyed, for she had become a grandmother for the first time. Ethan, her grandson, became her source of happiness and the center of her thoughts. She spent long hours holding him, singing old lullabies, and telling him stories of the past. "Ethan, you look just like your grandfather," she would whisper. "You will grow up to be a strong man, just like your father." Whenever she gazed at his little face, she felt a deep sense of peace, a light she hadn't known since her husband's passing. She loved sitting with him, sharing stories of how she had cared for David when he was his age. But as time went on, David became increasingly preoccupied with tending to his sheep and raising his son. He spent long days in the desert, sometimes forgetting to visit his mother. Even when he returned home, he would quickly eat and then focus on other matters, leaving his mother alone in the tent. Emma noticed this change. She felt sadness for Mrs. Eleanor, but also a growing concern for her husband and son. She realized things were not as they used to be. "Don't worry," she would tell Mrs. Eleanor. "I am here to take care of you." She did everything she could, cooking, keeping her company, ensuring she was comfortable. But Mrs. Eleanor knew in her heart that her son had started to drift away. She feared that time would pass without him realizing it. She wished he would return to her, but aging had made her weak. One sunny morning, as David sat with Emma outside the tent, he took a sip of water and then declared firmly, "I have decided. We are leaving today for a new grazing land. The soil here is no longer as it was. We must find a better place." Emma looked at him in shock. "And what about your mother?" David sighed, avoiding her gaze. Then he replied coldly, "She will stay here. She can no longer travel, and staying here is safer for her." Emma's face filled with disbelief. "Safe? You know wolves roam here at night. How can you leave her alone? You know what could happen." But David didn't want to hear any objections. He raised his hand, cutting her off. "Nothing will happen to her. She has lived here all her life, and she will remain here." Emma stood in front of him defiantly. "But she is your mother. How can you abandon her like this?" David turned away, unwilling to continue the conversation. "It's settled. Get ready to leave." Emma saw a coldness in his eyes she had never seen before. It hurt her deeply, but she remained silent. Inside the tent, Mrs. Eleanor had heard everything. Slowly, she stepped outside, her frail body trembling. She looked at her son with sorrow-filled eyes, but did not try to change his mind. Instead, she walked up to him and said, in a trembling voice, "If you believe this is what's best for you, then go." She then took Ethan's tiny hand, looked at him lovingly, and said, "Take care of your father, my dear. Be his support." David could not meet her gaze. He lowered his head and muttered, "I will come back soon. Take care of yourself." He climbed onto his camel, took his wife and son, and set off, leaving behind the tent that had witnessed his childhood and the mother who had watched over him all his life. Hours later, they reached a lush valley with rolling hills and a nearby water source, an ideal place for grazing. David sat under a tree, feeling a rare sense of relief. He turned to his wife, smiling. "Finally, we can start a new life here." Then he looked around and called out playfully, "Ethan! Come, let's play." Silence. David stood up, looking around with growing panic. Then he turned to Emma and asked in a trembling voice, Where is Ethan?" Emma met his gaze steadily. "I left him with your mother, just as you left her." At that moment, David's world spun. He remembered his mother's sorrowful eyes, her silent plea. He had ignored it all. And now, his son was there, alone, in the very place where he knew wolves prowled at night. Without another word, he leapt onto his camel and rode back as fast as he could, fear tearing through his heart. When he finally reached the tent at sunset, everything was eerily silent. Then he saw the tracks, small footprints, and large claw marks surrounding them. No, this can't be." Following the tracks frantically, he found them, his frail mother standing protectively over Ethan, 3 wolves circling them. Though weak, she fought them with all she had. "Mother!" David charged, swinging his staff. The wolves hesitated but didn't flee. He reached his mother just as she collapsed, gasping, "I knew you would come back. Forgive me, Mother." "Please." She smiled weakly, touching his tear-streaked face. "You are my son. I will always forgive you." From that day on, David changed. He cared for his mother, cherished her stories, and ensured she was never alone. He learned that kindness and devotion are the true foundations of life, and that honoring one's parents is not just a duty, but a blessing. Do we need a painful lesson to realize the value of our parents?